You're a young girl named Margot, just 15 years old, standing at the door of a cold stone cottage in the year 1347 AD. You've just been married. Your new husband, Henrik, is walking toward the bed you're now expected to share. He's nearly twice your age, chosen not for love but because he offered your father 3 pigs and half an acre of barley. The floor is covered with dry rushes, and they crunch under your bare feet as you take small, nervous steps. The dim candlelight dances across Henrik's rough, lined face. In your trembling hands, you're holding a coarse wool nightgown. Your mother made it for you, just as her mother made it for her. They both wore it on their own wedding nights. Outside the thin cottage walls, you can hear loud, drunken voices. His friends are drinking ale and yelling vulgar jokes. They're banging on pots with wooden spoons, waiting to hear a sign that the marriage has been officially consummated. They won't leave until they do. Your chest tightens. You can hardly breathe as Henrik reaches out with his calloused fingers and starts to untie the leather string around your neck. And in that moment, you think back to your mother's quiet warnings about what wifely duties really meant. But nothing could have truly prepared you for this small, dark, smoky room. The stink of sweat, damp wool, and bodies that haven't been washed in days. This isn't a romance. This is what real intimacy looked like in the medieval world. It was shaped by fear, superstition, religious pressure, and the brutal need to survive. Everything we think of today as personal or emotional was, back then, shaped by forces completely out of a woman's control. Before we go deeper into these harsh and often hidden stories from the past, if you're someone who enjoys uncovering the raw, uncomfortable truths of history, take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe for more content like this. And drop a comment below. Tell me where you're watching or listening from. I love knowing that people all over the world are joining in, connected by a shared curiosity about how human life used to be. Back in Margot's time, the bedroom wasn't a private space. It was a battleground where the most personal parts of life were ruled by the church, judged by neighbors, and tangled up in beliefs that now seem shocking. Sex wasn't about love. It was about power, control, reputation, and even eternal salvation. In Margot's world, the idea of marital rape simply didn't exist. A wife was considered her husband's property, and what he did with her was no one else's business. Menstrual blood was thought to be so dangerous, people believed it could kill crops. Sleeping in the wrong position could be seen as sinful and might even send your soul to hell. So, when Margot married Henrik in the fall of 1347 AD, no one raised a glass. There were no flowers, no music. It was a transaction. Her body was part of the deal, and the community had every right to demand proof that the deal was sealed. The ritual of the wedding night didn't start in the bedroom. It began much earlier with a tradition known as the bedding ceremony. As strange as it sounds to us today, wedding guests would physically drag the bride and groom to their sleeping quarters. There, they'd strip them down, sing vulgar songs, and then wait just outside the door, listening for any sound that proved the marriage had been physically sealed. Henrik's friends wouldn't leave until they heard Margot cry out in pain. What they believed was proof that her hymen had broken, and that the union was now official. But the strangest part of medieval intimacy wasn't the public involvement, was what the church taught about sex itself. Believe it or not, even a married couple could commit grave sins in their own bed. Take Saint Jerome. Writing in the 4th century AD, he claimed that if a man loved his wife too much, it was no different than adultery. For the church fathers, pleasure even between husband and wife was viewed as something dangerous. They saw it as a threat to the soul, not a blessing of love. This wasn't just abstract theology, influenced real people, real marriages, and daily life. The famous medieval thinker Thomas Aquinas, writing his Summa Theologica around 1265 AD, laid out detailed rules for what was considered acceptable sex within marriage. According to church doctrine, sex was only permitted on certain days of the week in specific seasons of the year, only in one position, man on top, woman underneath, face to face. Anything outside of that, any other posture, oral sex, or even touching during menstruation, pregnancy, or breastfeeding was labeled unnatural, shameful, and sinful. If couples followed all these rules exactly, they would be allowed to have sex only about 50 days per year. Margot learned all of this from her mother, who likely heard it in confession from the village priest. These weren't just rules, they were matters of eternal consequence. Every moment of closeness carried the weight of potential damnation. So when Henrik reached for her on a Wednesday during Lent, Margot was stuck between two equally terrible options: give in to her husband and possibly endanger her soul, or refuse and risk the anger of a man who had full legal control over her body. In a world where domestic violence wasn't just allowed, it was expected. Behind it all was a deep misunderstanding of women's bodies, ideas that would last for centuries. Medieval medicine, heavily influenced by ancient Greek and Roman texts, taught that women were basically just flawed versions of men. Their anatomy was seen as a reversed or incomplete form of male anatomy. The vagina, according to these beliefs, was simply a penis turned inside out, and the ovaries were thought to be internal testicles. This distorted view of the female body shapes not just medicine but also sex, marriage, law, and religion. For women like Margot, it meant living in a world where their pleasure, pain, and consent were all filtered through fear, ignorance, and doctrine. This wasn't just old superstition or a lack of knowledge. These ideas were taught as scientific fact in universities across Europe. Doctors, judges, priests, they all believed them, and the consequences were devastating, especially for women. One of the most influential medical writers of the time was Constantine the African, a physician working in the 11th century AD. He claimed that women experienced sex differently than men. According to him, a woman needed long foreplay and multiple orgasms in order to become pregnant. This theory led to one of the most harmful beliefs of the medieval period, that a woman couldn't get pregnant from rape because she supposedly couldn't reach the required level of pleasure. So, if a woman became pregnant after an assault, it was often seen in court as evidence that she must have enjoyed it, and if she enjoyed it, she was held partially responsible for what happened. That was the twisted logic of the time. Margot's mother may have also warned her about the so-called wandering womb, a condition medieval doctors believed could cause madness, panic attacks, and even death. They thought the uterus could literally move around inside a woman's body, floating upward toward her chest to choke her heart, or downward, trying to exit through the vagina. The treatments worked just as strange. To coax the womb back into its rightful place, healers would sometimes place sweet herbs near the vagina, hoping to attract it downward, or hold foul odors to the nose, trying to drive it away from the upper body. But the medical system wasn't the only source of fertility advice. The medieval church tried to control every aspect of sex and reproduction, but it couldn't fully erase the older pagan traditions that still lived on in villages and rural communities across the countryside. Wise women, later labeled as witches, quietly passed down herbal knowledge and fertility rituals, kept alive for generations in secret. These women knew which plants could help a woman conceive, which could prevent pregnancy, and which were believed to increase the chances of bearing a male child. In the dark forests around Margot's village, women would gather herbs by moonlight, choosing certain nights when they believed the plants would be at their most powerful. They brewed teas from plants like pennyroyal and tansy, both used as natural methods to prevent pregnancy, though dismissed by authorities. These practices were essential survival tools for women. They reflected a world where science, magic, faith, and fear were all mixed together, where a woman's body was a mystery, a risk, and a battleground from the moment she reached puberty. The line between medicine and magic in the medieval world was dangerously thin, sometimes fatal. Take the mandrake root, for example. Its shape resembled a tiny human body, and many believed that wearing it against the skin could increase a woman's chances of getting pregnant. It became so valuable that fake versions, often carved from the plant bryony, were sold in markets all across Europe. The church officially condemned these fertility charms as witchcraft. But in reality, even devout Christians used them. Most people couldn't clearly separate folk remedies from spells or sacred rituals. It was all part of trying to survive in a world full of uncertainty and danger. A woman might go to church wearing a crucifix, while secretly tucking a piece of amber between her breasts to prevent miscarriage. She might light a candle to Saint Margaret, the patron saint of childbirth, while quietly burying a piece of afterbirth under her doorstep, hoping it would help her conceive again. Medieval contraception was often a desperate gamble, a mix of superstition, poisonous substances, and old wives' tales passed down by word of mouth. Some women were told to jump backwards 7 times after sex to prevent pregnancy. Others drank wine mixed with crushed bees. But far worse were the remedies made from lead, mercury, or other toxic elements. These treatments were intended to prevent or end pregnancy, but they frequently ended up killing the woman too. The stakes were unbearably high. For married women, an unwanted pregnancy might mean another brush with death in childbirth, which was heartbreakingly common. Statistics suggest that 1 in every 3 women died either during labor or in the days that followed. For unmarried women, pregnancy could be even more devastating, bringing shame, exile, or even death. And in moments of total desperation, some women saw infanticide, though condemned by law, and the church has their only way out. At the heart of all this was a brutal truth. Medieval marriage was less about love and more about control, especially control over the female body. Marriages were arranged like strategic alliances, and a young girl's virginity was often the most valuable part of the deal. When Margot's father arranged her marriage to Henrik, her virginity was her dowry, worth more than gold, animals, or land. The hymen became a kind of currency, passed between families as proof that their daughter was pregnant, that her family's honor was intact. So the wedding night wasn't just about intimacy, it was a public performance. Everyone expected evidence. The blood-stained bedsheets would be displayed for all to see, proof that the bride had been a virgin and the marriage had been consummated properly. If no blood appeared, the consequences could be severe. A bride could be returned in disgrace, accused of deceit, and in extreme cases, even killed. That's how much pressure was placed on these girls, barely teenagers. Some would secretly prick their fingers or hide animal blood, like from a chicken, just to fake the evidence that everyone demanded. But the medical knowledge behind all of this was completely wrong. Medieval physicians believed that the hymen was a solid wall sealing the vaginal opening, and that it had to break and bleed the first time a woman had sex. They also assumed that if the hymen wasn't present, it was absolute proof that the girl was no longer a virgin. In truth, the hymen is a thin, stretchy tissue, and its presence or absence doesn't reliably prove anything. It can tear for many reasons, from horseback riding, sports, manual labor, or it might simply never have formed in the first place due to natural variation. Still, church doctrine held fast to this false understanding, and it gave rise to a whole set of bizarre, painful, and humiliating traditions around what it meant to be a pure bride. In medieval Europe, a marriage wasn't legally complete until the couple had sex. That meant consummation wasn't just a private moment, it was a legal requirement. If a dispute arose, it became a matter for the church courts, which would launch full investigations. They questioned both husband and wife separately, pressing for intimate details about their wedding night. Sometimes, they even inspected the woman's body for physical signs of penetration. Neighbors could be brought in to testify. What had they heard through the walls? Did they hear cries, laughter, silence? It may sound unthinkable today, but in that world, the bedroom was not private, it was a stage, and the church was the director. When it came to sexual positions, the church made its stance very clear. Only one was permitted, the man on top, face to face, what we now call the missionary position. This wasn't just a preference. It was taught as the only position that wouldn't send your soul to hell. Any other posture was considered unnatural and dangerous for the soul. If a woman was on top, it was seen as a threat to the divinely ordained male authority. Rear entry was labeled animalistic, compared to the way animals mate, and therefore considered sinful and degrading. But the actual reality of medieval sex was far more layered than the church would admit. There was a whole shadow culture that existed outside the reach of doctrine, hidden in literature, poetry, and street storytelling. In medieval France, bawdy tales, known as fabliaux, were wildly popular. These were comic, often sexual stories, told aloud by traveling minstrels in taverns, inns, and markets. They described encounters that would have shocked church officials, with women taking the lead, couples trying different positions, and people pursuing pleasure, even under the threat of eternal punishment. One of the boldest voices from this world was the French poet Andreas Capelanisis, writing around 1184 AD. His work on courtly love included detailed descriptions of flirting, courtship, and even sexual positions and techniques. It shows that among the nobility, at least, there was a surprisingly advanced and open interest in sexual enjoyment, completely at odds with the church's rigid views. But indulging in such practices was dangerous. Getting caught didn't just mean gossip. It could lead to excommunication from the church, banishment, or, in extreme cases, even death. Beyond the rules and punishments, people also lived in spiritual fear, haunted by tales of sexual demons. These weren't just old ghost stories. The succubus, a female demon, and the incubus, a male demon, were believed to attack people in their sleep, tempting them into sinful acts or draining them of life itself. For medieval believers, these demons were real threats. They were thought to prey on people during their most vulnerable moments, especially while sleeping alone or engaging in secret desires. In the medieval world, sexual demons weren't just myths, they were considered real, backed by both theology and medicine. The Church taught that demons like the succubus and incubus could take human form, seduce men and women, and drain their life force through sexual contact. The succubus, a female demon, was blamed for everything from sexual dreams to nocturnal emissions and even impure thoughts that occurred outside of marriage. For men, any sexual release that happened during sleep was often attributed to her. Theologians didn't stop at superstition, they developed detailed theories about how these demons operated. Some believed that a demon could appear first as a woman to extract semen from a man, then transform into a male to impregnate a woman with the stolen seed. Any child born from this kind of union was thought to be cursed or even demonic. The incubus, the male counterpart, was seen as even more threatening, especially to women. These demons were said to be stronger than humans, capable of physically overpowering their victims. If a woman reported disturbing dreams, feelings of being touched at night, or sensations she couldn't explain, she risked being accused of inviting demonic forces or worse, of being a witch herself. The boundary between victim and witch was terrifyingly narrow. What we now know as sleep paralysis, a harmless, neurological event where a person wakes up unable to move, was, at the time, interpreted as a demonic sexual attack. People who described pressure on their chest or strange, nighttime visions were believed to be under assault from dark spirits. The Church's answer: ritual exorcisms, purification rites, and, in some cases, execution by fire. Many people suspected of inviting demonic contact were burned as witches. Meanwhile, the understanding of menstruation in the Middle Ages was just as steeped in fear, superstition, and shame, and those beliefs persisted for centuries. Menstrual blood was thought to be poisonous. People believed it could destroy crops, spoil wine, and even weaken men's sexual strength just by being nearby. The Roman author, Pliny the Elder, whose writings were still taught in medieval universities, claimed that menstrual blood could make dogs go insane and cause metal tools to rust or lose their edge. Women who were on their period were seen as dangerous and unclean. They weren't allowed to enter churches, prepare food, or touch holy objects. In some villages, they were even forced to live in small huts outside the community until their bleeding stopped. The Church taught that menstruation was God's punishment for Eve's sin in the Garden of Eden, making every monthly cycle a symbol of female guilt and original shame. Because no one really understood how menstruation worked, medieval doctors developed bizarre and dangerous treatments. They believed that if menstrual blood wasn't released properly, it would build up inside the body and cause illness or even death. To prevent this supposed poisoning, women were prescribed bloodletting, vomiting, and other harsh remedies to balance the body's humors. Some physicians even encouraged intercourse during menstruation, claiming that male semen had healing properties that could neutralize the supposed toxins in the blood. But women didn't rely solely on male doctors. They built their own systems of care and secret knowledge, handed down from mothers to daughters, quietly and carefully, used moss, cloth, and sheepskin as makeshift menstrual pads. They tracked their cycles using the moon phases, and they brewed herbal teas to ease pain, regulate bleeding, or help with symptoms. Because this knowledge didn't come from the church or universities, it was often viewed as dangerous, even heretical, but for women, it was essential to daily life. By this time, complex theories about sexuality and fertility had also taken hold. Medieval doctors believed that astrological signs, body temperature, and the balance of bodily hues, hot, cold, wet, and dry, determined whether couples were sexually compatible. They thought that conception and sexual satisfaction depended on these mysterious forces being in the right alignment. Too much heat or dryness, they believed, could lead to infertility or worse, unwanted desires. In medieval Europe, people believed that sexual compatibility depended on more than just attraction. It was a matter of physical balance. A man considered hot by temperament might be unable to conceive with a cold woman, leading to sexual frustration and infertility. Among the wealthy, marriages were often preceded by physical evaluations. Physicians would examine the bride's body, interpreting features like wide hips as signs of fertility and narrow hips as signs of likely barrenness. Even the groom's penis, its size and shape, might be assessed to determine if he was a good match for his future wife. These examinations were often conducted with the same detached precision used to evaluate livestock. The church, meanwhile, offered a different perspective. It focused not on bodies, but on souls. Clergy taught that couples too closely related by blood or spiritual ties risked divine punishment, including sexual dysfunction or the birth of malformed children. Complex laws around kinship and spiritual relationships meant that many marriages were later annulled when hidden connections came to light. Sexuality in the medieval world was inseparable from questions of honor, shame, and status. A man's sexual performance wasn't just a private matter, it reflected his strength, masculinity, and leadership. Failing in the bedroom could tarnish his reputation, not just as a lover, but as a warrior and a man. In medieval society, male impotence wasn't just a private concern, it was a source of public shame. A man who failed sexually risked humiliation and the loss of his reputation. In places like medieval France, entire vocabularies of euphemism were developed to describe sexual dysfunction, reflecting the deep embarrassment surrounding the issue. For women, the stakes were even higher. Their entire social worth could hinge on sexual reputation. Even the smallest whisper of impropriety could ruin a woman's chances of marriage and bring disgrace to her entire family. In tightly knit towns where gossip traveled fast, a woman seen speaking to a man outside her family could be branded as promiscuous. The expectations were so strict that even married women lived in constant fear of slander and suspicion. These anxieties were built into the legal system. Rape, for example, was not defined as a crime against the woman herself, but as a violation against the man who owned her father, husband, or lord. Punishments varied wildly depending on class. A nobleman who raped a peasant woman might pay a small fine, but if a peasant man raped a noblewoman, he could be tortured or executed. Adultery laws were even harsher, but only for women. A married woman who had sex outside her marriage could be killed by her husband without facing legal consequences. In fact, many medieval legal codes explicitly granted husbands the right to murder adulterous wives and their lovers if caught in the act. Men, on the other hand, were largely free to sleep with unmarried women, prostitutes, or their own servants without any legal repercussions. Despite all this, the period also gave rise to elaborate courtship rituals, refined and romanticized, practices that would shape European ideas of love and honor for centuries to come. The tradition of courtly love, made famous by the poetry of the troubadours, created a world where sexual desire was transformed into a kind of spiritual journey. These romantic ideals mostly existed in literature and were enjoyed by the upper classes, but they deeply influenced how people in the Middle Ages viewed love and sexuality. According to this tradition, true love wasn't something that could exist within marriage. Instead, it was portrayed as a noble knight's devotion to a lady he could never truly have. His love for her was supposed to remain unfulfilled, an endless longing that would purify his soul through emotional suffering. As a result, there was a strange divide in medieval thinking. Marriage was for practical, sexual, and reproductive purposes, while love was idealized as pure, emotional, and detached from physical intimacy. But in reality, most medieval courtships were driven by practicality, not poetry. Among the peasantry, young people sometimes had a say in who they married, but money and family advantage always came first. A village girl might prefer the blacksmith's son, but if the local miller offered a better deal to her father, she would likely end up marrying the miller's son, even if she barely knew him. Some engagement customs were designed to test how well a couple might fit together. In certain areas, engaged partners were allowed to sleep in the same bed, fully clothed, with a wooden plank hold, a bundling board placed between them. This odd setup gave families a way to judge their physical compatibility while staying within church rules against premarital sex. Much of medieval sexual culture also borrowed from older, pagan traditions of magic and fertility rites. Although Christian authorities tried to wipe out these beliefs, they survived in secret, especially among peasants. Ancient rituals were often disguised as Christian holidays or folded into folk healing practices. One of the clearest examples was May Day. Though officially celebrated as a spring festival, it kept strong sexual associations, young villagers, would spend the night in the woods, supposedly to gather flowers and greenery for decoration. But in reality, May Day offered a rare chance for young people to flirt, experiment, and explore romance away from the watchful eyes of their families and the strict rules of village life. Many pregnancies were believed to result from May Day trysts, leading to noticeable spikes in births during the month of February. Weddings, too, were packed with fertility rituals aimed at boosting the couple's chances of having children. Guests might throw grains or nuts at the bride to encourage future pregnancies, while the marriage bed would be sprinkled with holy water. Behind the scenes, it was often also treated with herbs and charms, thought to promote fertility. These rituals reflected a deep desire to control reproduction in a world where infant death was common and a family's survival depended on producing healthy heirs. Medieval ideas about conception were a strange mix of ancient philosophy, Christian teaching, and folk beliefs. Following Aristotelian thought, many doctors believed that both men and women contributed seed during sex, and that both were necessary to create a new life. They also believed, wrongly and tragically, that a woman had to orgasm in order to conceive. This led to the cruel assumption that a woman who became pregnant from rape must have secretly desired or enjoyed it. People in the Middle Ages also developed complex theories about how to influence the sex of a baby before birth. Some believed that conceiving during specific phases of the moon could lead to a boy or a girl. Others thought that the alignment of the stars at the exact moment of conception not only determined the baby's sex, but also shaped their personality, destiny, and future success. As time went on, the medieval world became more aggressive in its efforts to monitor and control sexuality. The church built networks of informants to report on neighbors' private behavior. Confessionary generally meant as a spiritual cleansing was increasingly used to gather information. Priests would ask detailed, probing questions about people's sex lives, including frequency, positions, and whether they felt pleasure. By the 13th century, the rise of the Inquisition brought an even more brutal wave of sexual scrutiny. People accused of heresy were not only tortured into confessing their beliefs, they were also interrogated about their sexual behavior. Inquisitors used detailed manuals that included questions about positions used during intercourse, how often it occurred, and even how it felt. Those found guilty of sexual crimes were punished harshly. Medieval prisons sometimes included special forms of torture or humiliation, specifically designed for offenders accused of deviant sexual behavior. These punishments reflected the deep anxieties surrounding sex, control, and morality. In a world where faith and fear often ruled hand in hand, women found guilty of adultery could face horrific punishments. Some were locked in cages so small they couldn't even stand upright, fed nothing but bread and water, until they eventually died of starvation. Men convicted of rape might be publicly castrated and then executed by hanging. These brutal sentences were meant not only to punish the offenders, but to send a chilling message to the community: step out of line sexually, and the consequences would be severe. Although the medieval period produced a large body of writing about sex, most of it was kept out of reach for ordinary people. Medical treatises included detailed information about sexual techniques and positions, but these texts were intended for educated physicians or wealthy elites. For the average person, sexual knowledge came through gossip, bawdy folk songs, and often painful personal experience. The church also created its own vast library of sexual material, but its focus was on sin and punishment, rather than guidance or understanding. Penitential handbooks cataloged hundreds of specific sexual acts, each paired with a prescribed penance. These manuals reveal an almost obsessive interest in sexual behavior, an obsession that stood in stark contrast to the Church's teachings about chastity and purity. Marriage guides written for the nobility offer rare glimpses into the sexual expectations of the upper class. These books covered everything from how to approach the wedding night to how sex should be managed during a wife's pregnancy. Despite being framed within a moral and religious context, the texts demonstrate a surprisingly nuanced and informed view of sexual pleasure. These insights were reserved for those with wealth and status, people who could afford privacy, medical care, and the luxury of discretion. Meanwhile, systems of sexual control became increasingly elaborate. The infamous chastity belt, though probably far less common than modern myth suggests, still symbolized the deep fear of women's sexual independence. Whether real or imagined, Such devices reflected the anxiety surrounding female desire and the extreme lengths some were willing to go to suppress it. Prostitution existed in a legal gray area. The Church officially condemned it, calling it immoral and sinful. Yet at the same time, many secular governments licensed and regulated brothels. Most medieval cities had designated red light districts, where sex workers operated under strict rules. These women had to wear special clothing to mark them as prostitutes, live in specific neighborhoods, and submit to regular health checks. The medieval era gave rise to some of the strangest sexual customs in European history. One of the most infamous was the so-called rite of first night or droito signor, which supposedly allowed feudal lords to sleep with peasant brides before their husbands did. Historians still argue about whether this actually happened, but the very fact that people believed it could exist speaks volumes about how vulnerable peasant women were to sexual exploitation. In the minds of medieval Europeans, sex wasn't just a private act, it was something that could affect the world around them. People believed that sexual behavior could influence the weather, determine the outcome of wars, and shape the fate of entire kingdoms. Kings and nobles often consulted astrologers to find the most auspicious times to conceive children, convinced that the position of the stars at the moment of conception would shape the child's destiny. Military leaders, on the other hand, might ban sex entirely before a battle, fearing that it would sap their soldiers' strength and courage. As time went on, systems of sexual control became more sophisticated and more intrusive. Entire villages operated like moral surveillance networks, using intense social pressure to keep sexual behavior in line. Young men and women were rarely allowed to be alone together, and even married couples were expected to maintain a standard of modesty that matched the community's expectations. The Church's teachings had a deep impact on how people thought about sexual pleasure. Clergy warned that pleasure was a temptation designed by the devil to distract people from higher spiritual goals. Even within marriage, enjoying sex too much was considered dangerous to the soul, something that could lead to damnation. To combat their own desires, medieval people developed a whole toolkit of strategies to suppress sexual urges. Fasting was one of the most common methods, along with cold baths, physical punishment, and even wearing uncomfortable clothing. Young people were taught to avoid anything that might stimulate desire. Certain foods, kinds of music, or even particular stories and dances could all be considered dangerous. The medieval world gave rise to a hidden culture of sexual defiance and underground current of desire that flowed beneath the Church's rigid teachings and moral restrictions. Despite intense efforts to regulate sexuality, people continued to find ways to seek pleasure, form forbidden relationships, and resist the rules imposed on their bodies. This secret world of erotic rebellion coexisted uneasily with the official culture of control and punishment. Medieval sexuality was also shaped by daily realities that modern people rarely think about. In homes where privacy barely existed, sex often happened within earshot, or even in sight of children, servants, or relatives. The sounds, smells, and rhythms of sexual life were woven into the fabric of communal existence in ways that would deeply unsettle modern sensibilities. Social class played a major role in shaping sexual experience. The nobility enjoyed privileges that went far beyond wealth and power. They had access to privacy, luxury, and time, with private chambers, rare aphrodisiacs, and personal attendants. Noblemen and women could indulge their desires in ways that poor laborers could never imagine. For peasants, whose lives were ruled by work and survival, sexuality was rarely about pleasure and almost always about necessity. Marriage, too, was more about endurance than intimacy. In an era where death came early and often, marriage served one key purpose: producing children who could inherit land, tend crops, or secure political alliances. Romantic love and sexual fulfillment were luxuries most people could not afford. In fact, too much sexual pleasure was often treated with suspicion as something indulgent, sinful, even dangerous. And yet, within this climate of repression, resistance bloomed. People whispered secrets, carved obscene graffiti, told bawdy tales, and found joy in each other's arms when they could. Even the harshest moral codes could not erase the human craving for touch, connection, and pleasure. Medieval people developed quiet but determined ways of pushing back against the forces that tried to control their bodies and desires. And so we return to Margot. Alone in her cold stone cottage, the flicker of candlelight catching on Henrik's outstretched hands. Her fear is more than personal. It is the fear of a world that sees her body as something to be watched, controlled, judged. The fear of a church that teaches her desire is sinful. The fear of neighbors who will gossip and condemn. And yet beneath all of it, she feels something else, a raw instinct to survive, to protect herself, to endure. In Margot's trembling shoulders, we feel the full weight of a culture where sexuality was both weapon and curse, both danger and need. The medieval period reminds us that human sexuality has always been entangled with power, fear, and control. Many of the sexual customs and beliefs from that time strike us today as strange, even disturbing, but they arose from the same essential needs and desires that still shape our behavior now. By studying medieval sexuality, we begin to see that our own sexual culture, too, is built upon deep foundations of authority, anxiety, and resistance. In the Middle Ages, intimacy was never just personal. It was always exposed, always judged, always dangerous. The bedroom was not a sanctuary, it was a battleground, a place where souls were won or damned, where family honor rose or fell, where the most private acts of love were subject to rules designed less for joy than for punishment. Medieval Europe created some of the harshest sexual codes in history, but it also revealed just how unstoppable human desire can be. Even in a world dominated by religious fear, legal violence, and constant surveillance, people still found ways to love, to touch, to find pleasure. Their passions, silent, hidden, sometimes punished, endured. These stories remind us that sexuality is not a modern invention or a passing trend. It is something ancient, essential, and uncontainable. It is a force that no institution, no law, no doctrine has ever fully suppressed. The strange and often brutal sexual customs of the Middle Ages were not simply the products of ignorance or superstition. They reflected a complex web of faith, politics, economics, and deeply human yearning. Understanding these customs helps us see not only how far we've come, but also how many of the same tensions still exist today between pleasure and shame, freedom and fear, love and control. In the end, the medieval world teaches us a powerful lesson. Sexuality is always political, it is always dangerous, and it is always central to what it means to be human. The flickering candle still casts shadows on Henrik's worn face as he reaches for young Margot. But now we understand, this isn't just a personal moment between two people. This scene carries the full weight of an entire culture's sexual fears and longings. Her trembling hands, his calloused fingers, together they form a living portrait of a civilization trying, and often failing, to reconcile desire with danger, longing with law. What unfolds between them is not just a fleeting act of intimacy. It is the echo of centuries of repression, rebellion, and hope. It is the human spirit, reaching for connection in a world that has never made that simple or safe. And it reminds us that the fight for sexual freedom and emotional truth is not new. It is one of humanity's oldest, most enduring struggles.